you need to be on page 522 in your book. Corresponding parts of congruent figures. If two figures are congruent, then their corresponding sides are congruent, and their corresponding angles are congruent. So if you look at the symbols, it says triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. The line or the equals with the little squiggly above it, that means congruent. So anytime you see that equals with a little squiggly line above it, that just means congruent. Congruent means the same shape, same size. So as we look at this, if ABC is congruent to DEF, if you look at the positions of the letters, that will tell you what sides and what angles are congruent. You can also look at the tick marks in the figure themselves. So if you look at angle A has one tick mark in it, as does angle D. So A and D are congruent. B has the right angle marks, as does E, so B and E are congruent. C has two tick marks, as does F, so C and F are congruent. If you look at side lengths, and again, I can look at either the lettering on A, B, C, D, E, F, or I can look at the tick marks. So if I look here, AB has one tick mark, as does DE. So AB is congruent to DE. CB has two, as does EF. So BC is congruent to EF. And then finally, AC has three, as does DF. So CA and FD are congruent. In the figure below, the two triangles are congruent because triangle DEF is the image of triangle ABC reflected over the line M. The notion triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF is read triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. The corresponding figures that match or correspond are called congruent corresponding parts. Look at example 1. It says write congruent statements comparing the corresponding parts in the congruent triangles shown. So I'm going to go here to new paper, and again I'm going to do the same thing that I did on the other figure. I'm going to look at tick marks. So I'm going to start with G. G has one tick mark, as does J. So angle G is congruent to angle J. I has two tick marks, as does L. So angle I is congruent to angle L. H has three tick marks, as does K. So angle H is congruent to angle K. If I go back and do side lengths, notice that GH has one tick mark, as does JK. So I'm going to say that side GH is congruent to side JK. Notice GI has two tick marks, as does JL. So I'm going to say side GI is congruent to side JL. And then finally, IH has three tick marks, as does LK. So I'm going to say IH is congruent to LK. Please make sure that you have that written down. I want you to pause the video and I want you to do got it on page 523. Let's start with angles. Notice angle M has one tick mark, as does angle A. So notice angle A is congruent, or angle M is congruent to angle A. Notice as we follow along, MN is the diagonal, as is AB. So we also know that MN is congruent to AB, which means that angle N is congruent to angle B. If I keep going clockwise on my first figure and then counterclockwise on my second figure, I know that NO is congruent to BK, which means that angle O is congruent to angle K. If I keep going, I know that OP is congruent to KS, which means angle P is congruent to angle S. And then finally, I know that PM is congruent to SA. A. Notice I have a four-sided figure, so I should have 4 angles and 4 sides. Example 2 says triangle ABC is congruent to triangle XYZ. Write a congruent statement comparing the corresponding parts, then determine which transformation was used from ABC to XYZ. I do not need you to do that. All I want you to do right now is do the corresponding sides and corresponding angles. To do this, I would use these letters. Like positions are going to match on the figure. So if I look at this, A is in the first spot, as is X. That means A and X are congruent. Second spot is B and Y. That means B is congruent to Y. Third spot is C and Z. That means C is congruent to Z. I can also use this method to figure out my side lengths. Notice AB is the first 2 letters, as is XY. So AB is congruent to XY. BC is the last 2, as is YZ. So BC is congruent to YZ. And then AC is first and last, as is X and Z. So CA is congruent to ZX. So if you're not sure looking at the picture which sides are congruent, because if you notice we don't have any tick marks to look at, use the congruent statement that you're given. That congruent statement has to be written where they are lined up. Whatever's in the first spot is congruent to the first spot, second spot, third spot, third spot. Pause the video and do letter B. B says parallelogram WXYZ is congruent to parallelogram KLMN. Write congruent statements comparing the corresponding parts. You do not need to determine which transformation was used, so we're going to just cross that off. All I want you to do is write the congruent statement. So if I start with my angles, notice angle W is first, as is angle K. So W and K are congruent. Angle X is second, as is angle L. Angle Y is third. Angle M is third. Angle Z is fourth, as is angle N. I didn't even use that picture. I didn't need that picture at all. All I need is that statement right there. I can do the same thing with sides. WX is first, as is KL. XY is next, as is LM. YZ is the last 2 letters, as is MN. And then finally, WZ is first and last, as is KN is first and last. You have 4-sided figure, which means you should have 4 angles and 4 sides. So make sure that when you're done, your congruent statement matches your figure. If you have a 3-sided figure, you should have 3 angles, 3 sides. If you have a 5-sided figure, you should have 5 angles, 5 sides. So make sure that that is consistent. Turn the page over to 524. Lastly, finding missing measures. You can use properties of congruent figures to find the missing measure. Miley is using a brace to support a tabletop. In the figure, BCE is congruent to DFG. If angle CEB is here, which means we're looking at angle E, what is the measure of angle FGD? FGD is here, which means I need angle G. Well, if I go back and look at my congruent statement, I can see that angle G is the same as angle E. If angle E is 50 degrees, then angle F also has to equal 50 degrees. Pause the video and do letter C. C says in the figure shown above, the length of CE is 2 feet. CE is here. What is the length of FG? Again, if I go back and look at my congruent statement, I can clearly see FG is the same as CE. Well, if CE is 2, then FG is 2.